So this project was started many months ago, before COVID, if we can still remember what that period of time looked like. So this presentation is not about COVID or its impact on the labor market, but there are things we will end up saying about some of the applications of this classification approach that we've proposed. This is not anything particularly earth-shattering, but we just thought by using a different way of clustering occupations, we'd find another lens by which to understand both what jobs York Region residents work in, as well as what jobs are present in York Region. And that in itself is those are two different categories, right? Because where York Region residents may not necessarily work in York Region. Many of them commute outside the area, and similarly, jobs in York Region are filled by people who don't live in York Region. And so the goal here really is to both provide a different analytical tool to look at these occupations, but also to provide a different narrative to see if we see things by categorizing them in a different way. Do we see a different picture of how we understand the labor market dynamics in York Region? So we already have ways of classifying occupations. We do them by industry. So we have categories like construction or retail trade or manufacturing. And we also have specific occupational categories that we use when we try and understand jobs. So health occupations, ones listed here, occupations in education, law and social services, and so on. We have 20 industry categories when we look at classifying jobs, and we have 10 occupational categories when we classify jobs by occupations. The problem is those are rather broad ranges. So for example, if we're looking at health occupations, if we say health occupations are growing, we don't know if that means there are more nurses and more doctors, or does it mean there are more dental assistants, or are there more technicians who are working in labs? The problem with the classifications we currently have is that they don't distinguish by the range of skill levels. And so we wanted to try and take both those functional categories of people working in rather similar types of jobs, and also make sure that each cluster represents a category where the skill level is more or less the same. Right? So the broad classification that we used was based on the education level that typically is required for a job in any given category. So there you see the 14 clusters that we've proposed, and I will in the next couple of slides go through each of those clusters to explain what occupations make up those clusters. But the three broad distinctions we make are in terms of the level of education typically required for that job. So one are jobs that usually require a university degree. Secondly, are jobs that either usually require a college diploma or an apprenticeship or a trade certificate. And thirdly, jobs that either require a high school diploma or else require no level of education, that it's just a job that can be taken on with some on-the-job training or initial orientation. So you can see we have 4 clusters in that first category, 6 clusters in the second category, and 4 in the third category. So let me take that first category, jobs that usually require a university degree. When it comes to labeling, it's always a challenge. So forgive us sometimes with some of the terms we've come up with, but it's always a delicate issue trying to name these. So the first one is rule makers. So these are individuals who are leaders in their organizations or high-level professionals in the business and in the business sector and in government. So it's not all managers, but high-level managers, senior managers, what we call senior executives, lawyers, accountants, kind of the, what you might consider the typical Bay Street occupations. Second category were sustainers. So these are also professionals, but they're in health, education, and social services. So this is where we have physicians, dentists, nurses, professors and teachers in high school and in elementary, social workers. So we're talking about masters or bachelors in social work. Third category are calculators. So these are essentially the STEM occupations, the science, technology, engineering, and mathematics occupations, and includes, of course, IT professionals. And we also put in policy researchers, so policy researchers working as policy advisors across the whole range of categories. And finally, in this first grouping, we have artists. So this is these are the people who produce artistic or entertainment content, editors, writers, directors of shows, actors, musicians, painters, and so on. And these are illustrative. There's more occupations that fill these these clusters, but we're trying to give illustrations in each category. So then that second grouping of jobs that usually require a college diploma or apprenticeship certificate. Here we have administrators, and we use the word technicians, and you'll see that the word technician is regularly used because many of these jobs are usually kind of in aid of the jobs we just looked at. Okay, so administrators are typically supporting rule makers. They're middle managers, or they have administrative roles in offices, or they're specialists, sales specialists in categories like wholesale trade, or real estate agents, or insurance brokers. Supporters similarly line up with sustainers. They're also in the health and social categories, education and social categories. So we have technologists and technicians, paralegals, early childhood educators. Technologists also parallel those calculators. They're the technologists and technicians in the STEM categories. They're the drafts people, the engineering assistants, and also other occupations like air pilots and air traffic controllers. Artisans parallel those artists. They're kind of the applied creative class of photographers and operators of camera and video equipment, graphic artists and designers and recording technicians. And we also have in this category coaches and athletes. Protectors is an unusual category because it's usually not unpacked in this way, but we did so because we'll see later on they have their own very unique characteristics compared to similar occupations at the same education level. So the protectors include police officers and firefighters and sheriffs and correctional service officers. And then we have what we call makers. So these are skilled tradespeople, typically, almost always those who are trade certificates that are necessary to work in those occupations, and includes also contractors and supervisors, primarily in construction, manufacturing, utilities, and in the primary sector. So people who are supervising workers in primary industries. And then the last category, jobs that require a high school diploma or less, 4 broad clusters: laborers, so entry level or skilled, lower skilled or lower paid manual workers. And the thing I'll mention here is that In some cases, it is important to note that these they may be entry level, but they may sometimes require higher skills than one might imagine. But the problem is they often are lower paid. And so we also clustered jobs that were lower paid even when they had a skill component to them. We don't want to say these are entirely unskilled jobs, but they are lower skilled than the jobs in the previous clusters. So these will be workers who are installers or equipment operators, truck drivers, assemblers in manufacturing, and laborers in construction, and so on. Clerical are those supporting entry-level jobs in offices. The general office workers or general office clerks, receptionists, and so on. Servers is a broad category. Again, they're entry-level or lower skilled or lower paid service occupations. So there you will see some occupations here where people will say, gosh, you know, these are not unskilled people. Like hairstylist is a mandatory skilled trade. You cannot operate as a hairstylist without having a trade certificate. But the problem is hairstylists on average make around, you know, $20,000 to $25,000 a year. It's a very low paid in relation to other skilled workers. We have personal support workers here who also require certification or a training period in order to perform their work, but very low paid. We have in here as well food and beverage servers, cashiers, shelf stockers, food counter attendants, and so on. And then finally, the sales category. So this is primarily people who work as retail salespersons, but we also put in retail sales supervisors into this category. So that's the description. Those are the 14 categories. So let me give a sense of what kind of scale, what size we have here in terms of these categories. So these are, first of all, we rely on 2016 census data. And yes, the numbers will have changed, but the important point to note are the proportions, the relative sizes between these various occupations. So these are York residents who are employed by the different occupational clusters. I guess, you know, looking at the first column where we have the numbers, the large categories, you see the biggest category, administrators, 104,000 residents working as administrators. Rule makers, again, another large category. Servers, actually second after administrators are servers. They're second from the bottom, 88,000. And laborers is the fourth largest, also just a few rows from the bottom. And some of the categories are extremely small. On that protectors category, around, you know, in comparison to the administrators, it's only 3,000. Artists, 5,000. Artisans, 12,000. Those are lower categories. And what we did in the next columns, we showed the percentage distribution of these clusters, starting among York Region residents. And then we wanted to compare it to Toronto and the rest of Ontario. Now, the reason why we don't just compare it to the rest of Toronto is that, the rest of Ontario, sorry, is that Toronto is very distinct in terms of its occupational profile. And we find it useful when we're making a comparison, to separate Toronto from the rest of Ontario. So we've shown the percentage distribution by these clusters, and then we highlighted those proportions where the percentage is higher. So we've shaded that green, higher than typically is found elsewhere, and where it's typically lower, we've shaded it pink. So you can see, again, those administrators in York Region are much, you know, significantly higher. Similarly, the number of rule makers who live in York Region or who live in Toronto is notably higher than their presence in the rest of Ontario. On the other hand, for example, looking down at York Region at the bottom, that large category of servers, compared to Toronto or the rest of Ontario, actually a smaller proportion of servers. And you can cast your eye on some of the others. Toronto, for example, has higher number of artists, higher number of artisans compared to either York Region or the rest of Toronto. In terms of income, again, we're using census data, and it's older data, but I think the point here is the relative positions of these different occupations. And we've placed them in order of the size of the income. The income is full-time, full year. So we're not counting people who work part-time or who work only a few months a year, so that we have the same, we're comparing equal length of work in terms of comparing incomes. And we've color-coded the occupations so that you can see the educational requirements that put these into three broad groupings. So those jobs that usually require a university degree, we've put them at orange, that require a college or a trade certificate blue, and the high school or less pink. And more or less, you will have a sequence of university jobs being paid more, and college slightly less, and high school less than that. But the thing to note, I mean, this is where, for example, those protectors kind of stand out. They are a job that typically requires a college diploma, but they rank second after rule makers in terms of their average employment income. Now, these are employment of income of residents, so it doesn't necessarily mean that the jobs in York Region pay that level, because they could be working elsewhere. You'll also see that a job like artist, which typically requires a university degree, is actually lower than most of the other college level jobs that are listed on this chart: administrators, technologists, makers, supporters. Two of those large categories, like we said before, the four largest categories, among the four large categories were laborers and servers. And you can see they make up, they're at the bottom of the list, and significantly lower salaries. Those salaries are also sometimes vary even by geography. So here I'm using the same figures for York Region for those occupations, and again comparing it to Toronto and the rest of Toronto. So at the top we have the average salary. Again, this is, I'm going to repeat, this is full-time, full year. And Toronto average salary, resident salaries are slightly higher than York Region, and you can see the rest of Ontario falling much less than the average salaries. Then you take certain clusters, rule makers. So rule makers who live in Toronto, you see their salaries are 152,000 compared to 120 in York Region, and versus the rest of Ontario much lower. But it's not to say that Toronto always has the highest average income for any given cluster. In the case of calculators, York Region figures are higher. There are technologists around the same as the rest of Ontario, but certainly higher than Toronto. The protectors living in York Region have a higher salary than protectors living in Toronto and the rest of Ontario. And again, I want to emphasize, that's not to say that York Region police are being paid that much higher, because in fact, only around 45% of York Region police actually live in York Region. So less than half of the police in York Region live there. 55% come from outside York Region. And that's actually, if you find that surprising, actually police, for more so than most other occupations, tend not to live in the area where they work. So for example, in the city of Toronto or in the region of Peel, only around 24% of police officers live in the region where they work. So you have all these different anomalies in terms of not only income, but in terms of where people work and and the commuting. So the numbers we were looking at had to do with residents, but I also want to show the distribution by jobs. So these are actually jobs present in these areas. So in York Region, in Toronto, rest of Ontario. One of the problems here that I need to highlight is that we can only talk about jobs that have a fixed location. That means that it's a job that where someone goes to work and is always working in the same place every day. That's how we can place it in terms of a geographic location. So people who work at home, or people who work in an office, or people who work in a factory or a university, we can tell you, we can spot that location. But there are a number of jobs where people move from place to place. And the most obvious example is in construction. Many people who work in construction move from one construction site to another, so they don't show up on these statistics, and so they will be slightly undercounted. I just want to make that distinction. But again, in terms of those categories, you can see York Region administrators, again, much higher number compared to 18.4% compared to the figures for Toronto or the rest of Ontario. Servers, lower number of server jobs in York Region compared to Toronto. Well, Toronto's almost equal, but certainly compared to the rest of Ontario. And even jobs like makers. For example, it's not a very high category compared to, well, it's in the range of compared to the rest of Ontario, and sales, higher proportion of sale jobs in York Region, 5.1%. Now, I also want to look at these clusters to see what kind of demographics they represent. So we took these clusters. Again, these are York Region residents, and showed the divide by gender, males and females. So at the top, you can see all occupations. Males make up 52% of the workforce, females make up 48%. So that's the dividing line in terms of our labor force. But if you extended that line down the whole list, you'll see that actually there are very few occupations, only like 5 or 6, where the split is more or less 50-50. Most of our occupations, and it's pretty clear here in terms of these occupational clusters, have a gender bias. They either largely male or substantially male or substantially female. You know, just going down the list. Sustainers are 72% female. Calculators, 71% male. Going down further, supporters, 80% females. Technologists, 6% technologists. Males, sorry. Protectors, 82% males. Makers, 95%. Laborers, see, like in so many of these categories, it's not just that it's 60-40, it's often 70 or 80, and sometimes even 90% of one gender or another. It's just remarkable to think that in 2020, we still have such a strong stereotypical distinctions in terms of occupations. When we divide them by immigrant status, again, the split is almost 50-50 among York Region residents. All occupations, 48% are Canadian born, 52% immigrants. And here, if you draw that line down the middle, you see actually most of the occupations actually do fall within that same split. It's actually unusual to have something that's more imbalanced. Two occupations that stand out: calculators. 70% of calculators are immigrants. Protectors, 78% of protectors are Canadian born. And there's a few others, but those are the two that really stand out. Similarly, by visible minority status, so York Region, 53% are what are called non-visible minorities and 47% are visible minorities. Here, there's a bit more range, but still, by and large, closer to the 50-50 even point. Sustainers are 60% non-visible minorities. Calculators are 60% visible minorities. Protectors are 78% non-visible minorities. So those are just some of the kind of demographic features of these clusters. Next, we just wanted to talk about that connection between where people live and where people work. So first of all, we're going to start with where do York Region residents work? Just slightly over half of York Region residents work in York Region, so 53%. Now, sorry, I should mention here, and it's really important, the data we have on commuting means that we're only measuring people who are leaving their house and going to a job that has a fixed workplace. So this data will not count people who are working at home, which on average is around 10 or 12%. And again, we're talking about pre-COVID, of course, because I think we're all at home right now. It also doesn't include those occupations that don't have a fixed workplace. But it's still, the majority of workers are included in this present in this profiling here. And again, it's the relative comparisons between the occupations that are important. So among people who leave their homes and go to a fixed workplace, 53% of York Region residents work in York Region and 47% go outside. But again, if you go down, looking at that midpoint, some occupations we have a very high proportion of people leaving York Region. Among rule makers, 63% leave York Region every day for work. Among calculators, 68%. Technologists, 58%. And on the other hand, you've got other occupations where they more typically work closer to home. And especially as you go further down the list, obviously the ones that really stand out are servers, 69% work in the York Region, sales, 75%. Lower paying jobs will usually result in people being less mobile. And in fact, even if you look at within a given cluster, let's say even we take rule makers or calculators, those who commute further typically have higher incomes, or it's not because they're commuting that they have higher incomes, but because it's higher incomes that gives them the reason to commute further, because they're going to a job that is better paying, so they'll put in the extra time for their commute. So the next slide is the flip side of it. These are the York Region jobs so those that are fixed workplaces in York Region. So who works in them? Well, as it turns out, among those fixed workplaces, among jobs in York Region, 56% of those jobs are filled by York Region residents. Again, it seems like a lower figure. Some jobs, sustainers, for example, those professionals in health, education, and social services, 65% of them are York Region residents, which points out another thing, which is that typically men commute farther than women. And remember, we saw sustainers, a larger portion of females. It turns out more York residents working in those jobs, partly having to do with the fact that more females are working in those jobs. We saw administrators and rule makers, many of them leaving York Region to go for jobs elsewhere. But on the other hand, many of the rule maker jobs and administrator jobs in York Region are filled by York Region residents. Um, but what it tells us, though, is that there's a lot of movement in any given cluster between York Region, people leaving York Region and coming into York Region. And we're going to give an illustration here. These are those administrator jobs. So these are the actual numbers. Again, it's 2016. And we see that in the middle, 41,000 York residents are working in York Region in administrator jobs. But almost 30,000 are leaving each day to go to Toronto, 29,985. At the same time, there's around 14,000 Toronto residents who are commuting to York Region for jobs as administrators. You look at the movement between Peel and York. Around an equal number of administrators leave each day to go work in Peel, and meanwhile, 5,000 Peel residents are also going to York each day to work as administrators. You know, what we're trying to illustrate here is that it's not just the net figure. There's actually a huge amount of back and forth, which explains sometimes why you know, all our highways are clogged in both directions in morning and evening, because it's not just certain occupations. Among most occupations, there's just this tremendous amount of movement back and forth, and most of the movement for York Region is toward Toronto. But in most of these clusters, we also find that there's a large number of people leaving Toronto and coming to work in York Region. So one of the things we wanted to focus on, we had mentioned about some of these large categories. This slide wants to focus in on 4 clusters in particular. So we look at that, the bottom box there. We have 4 clusters of rule makers, administrators, calculators, and clericals. These are these are largely office workers. And we wanted to divide them further by trying to identify office workers who work in the private sector. So we broke it down by looking only at office workers in the following industries on the right-hand side: wholesale trade, finance and insurance, real estate and rental leasing, and professional, scientific, and technical services. And so these were the actual numbers of residents by these categories. And the point we wanted to illustrate here is, just like if you just eyeball these bars, York actually has a very high proportion of its workforce, resident workforce, who are working in office jobs. In fact, for York Region, the percentage is 46%. And it's only the only municipality or region that has a slightly higher is Ottawa. Ottawa has 47% of its residents who work in office jobs. But when you look at Toronto, well, Toronto does have more office workers. Proportionately, actually only around 41% of Toronto residents work in offices. So number one, Peel has a very large number, only second to Ottawa in terms of the number of office workers in its workforce. But what's different between York and Ottawa is how many more of its workers work in the private sector. You know, Ottawa is the the administrative center of the federal workforce primarily, and so in Ottawa, that blue category there, that's only around 14% of all their workers are private sector office workers. In York, 23% of York residents work in private sector office jobs. And that's higher, that percentage is higher than any other community in Ontario, which is a bit of a surprise. I don't know if we would have been able to kind of focus in on that if we hadn't kind of started clustering these jobs in a different sort of way. Um, uh, Similarly, if we look at the jobs that are present in a locality using that same classification, now York figures aren't necessarily as high. Certainly now the Toronto figures, the proportion of jobs that exist in Toronto, there are definitely more office jobs. 47% of jobs in Toronto are office jobs. But York is not all that far behind. It's around 41%. Ottawa is high. It's 49%. It's also the highest number of office jobs in the province. But York comes in at around third among all communities. So again, it has a high number of people who are working in office jobs, and also it has a fairly high number of office jobs that are present within York Region. So what we wanted, having established that, we thought, okay, well now with COVID, this does raise an interesting issue, because who is it that ends up working from home? So this slide, and I'm going to walk you through this, is again using 2016 figures. We took those 4 clusters of rule makers, calculators, administrators, and clericals, those office jobs that we mentioned. First column talks about, these are the numbers of the total number of residents working in those clusters. And the second column is, we developed an estimate of the potential for those people to work from home. And that, in the report, we provide in the appendix the methodology, but we relied on a couple of American studies that came out in April. When the lockdown started happening, people already started trying to figure out what's going to be the impact on the labor market. And one of the things they saw with the lockdown was that certain people were able to work from home and certain were not. And so they worked out some estimates. So based on these estimates, we applied them to these occupations, and we determined a potential. This is the potential number of people who could work from home in these different categories. And if you just eyeball it, you'll see that, for example, if it says 13,000 clericals could work from home out of around 26,000 clericals. So around 50% of them could easily work from home. Rule makers, almost 2/3 of them, more than 2/3, could work from home. So then we took the number of people who were already working from home before COVID. So that's the third category, and we subtracted that because they're already from home. Leaving that, we then distributed the rest according to the proportion of how many commute to a job in York Region, how many commute to a job outside York Region. But let me go back to the second column, the potential number of workers who can work from home. The total for all those office workers was around 153,000. If we take all the other clusters of York Region residents working in York Region, only around 26,000 of them could work from home. So this grouping of office workers is the big category of those who can work from home. Clearly, if you're working as a server, if you're working as a personal support worker, if you're working as a food and beverage server, you're working as a laborer in a factory, you can't work from home. But this is the category that is the primary category when it comes to those working from home. So when you look at those, for example, in those last columns of those who are commuting, it's so much more disproportionately weighted towards those in these office jobs. What does that mean? Well, then we said, okay, if that's the potential, we made some calculations at the bottom. Imagine if we took this number and imagine if each of them spent 1 day a week working from home, or 2 days a week, or 4 days a week. And the numbers really start adding up. If all these people who could potentially work from home did work from home for 2 days a week, you're looking at around 23,000 people who commute to a job in York Region working from home, and another 30,000 who commute outside York Region working from home. That's a huge shift. That's like a shift of 50,000 people. What are the consequences? Well, it's going to have consequences, obviously, for downtown Toronto. We already know that the restaurants and bars and various services in downtown Toronto, let alone the commercial office space, what that implication will be. But there's certainly going to be implications for York Region. And given that York Region has such a high number of people in this category compared to other communities, and such a high number, particularly in the private sector, the implications for York Region is probably greater than almost any other community in Ontario. It's going to have consequences even in terms of other jobs, let's say like servers in York Region, because even though they're working from home, people are still going to want to order out. They're going to want to perhaps meet with friends after work. They want to maybe pick up a coffee. And in those categories, we don't necessarily even have, we have smaller proportions of workers in those categories compared to the provincial average. So I think there's some, there's interesting policy implications and planning implications, the urban planning implications, and obviously transit and commuting pattern implications. So I'm going to wrap it up here. Just to say, to kind of, I guess, highlight that York Region is distinct in terms of its profile of occupations, particularly as I've been emphasizing, this collection of office workers and people employed in private sector office work jobs. It stands first in that category in all of Ontario. And with this last slide, the implications in terms of commuting patterns suggest that there's going to be a significant impact in terms of York Region, which may have also a bearing in terms of creating more demand for service occupations in York Region, whereas it's going to cause a decrease in demand for service occupation jobs in downtown Toronto, for example. And finally, I also want to highlight the issues around, the employment incomes that we have at one end, rule makers and other categories that have fairly high levels of income, and some of our large categories of jobs, particularly among the server categories, showing up in laborers, showing up with very low levels of income. And I think, again, during the pandemic, these are certainly, the servers were those categories of essential workers that so many of us talked about, that for whom we place such reliance, and who were the ones who were bearing a large part of the labor burden, and while working under fairly low levels of remuneration. So I'm going to do the stop sharing here of the slides so that I can get to the Zoom menu. We said that we'd have a few minutes for some questions if people had some questions they wanted to pose. So if you have any questions, you can type them into the Q&A category. And the one question I see is people are asking if there's going to be a copy of slides available. As I understand, the report is available on the website, the full report, and that can be downloaded from the York Region Workforce Planning Board website. Someone else was asking, how have these figures changed over time? So let me just check my notes here. By and large, when we look over the last couple of censuses from 2016, sorry, from 2006 to 2016, those server jobs have been growing in York Region. They've grown significantly, around 50% increase. Rule maker jobs and administrator jobs have grown, and I think what that reflects partly like if the profile of York Region are these office workers, then it also does make sense for people to start locating businesses closer to where people live so they don't have to commute as far. Um, and so that's the profile of the York Region workforce. And so it's not surprising that one may also have a lot of back office functions being carried out in York Region, because that's the nature of the resident workforce. People, I know I'm in York Region, have often wanted to see how they can attract more businesses from downtown Toronto, more of those office jobs from downtown Toronto, to have them located in York Region. And oddly enough, this pandemic may end up doing that. Not that those offices are going to move to York Region. It's just that more people are going to now work from home, because having had this experience, businesses are seeing that they were able to stay relatively productive with people working from home. So, in an odd sort of way, York Region may be getting its wish. I was asked if I could share the description of rule makers and administrators. So rule makers are the professional functions in business and office jobs. So we're talking about senior managers, senior executives, HR, executive vice presidents, and finance officers, and lawyers, and financial advisors, and accountants. And whereas administrators are those kind of technical mid-range occupations. So they're administrative officers. They are specialized, they're mid to low level managers. So that'll include retail and food and beverage managers, but also managers in manufacturing, and it'll include specialized sales force occupations like wholesale trade, sales people, and real estate agents and insurance agents. So it's a lot, and supervisors in offices. Another question here is clarify, how does core private office differentiate from RCAC office facilities? So RCAC was the cluster. So it was rule makers, calculators, administrators, and clericals. So those are the four kind of office sector occupations. And then the core private office were those people working in those clusters who worked in what we called private sector industries. And I'm just getting my notes here. So that included working in wholesale trade, in professional, scientific, and technical services. So those are like engineering offices or lawyers' offices, real estate and rental and leasing, and finance and insurance. So so the other side, so those that are not private sector, we have a lot of private public sector offices in public administration, so obviously in federal, provincial, and municipal level governments, but also like in educational services. So when you think of all the administrative staff in universities and colleges, and in the school system, and in healthcare, phenomenal amount of office jobs in healthcare services. You go to a hospital, and there's probably as many people, or as many people in an office job in a hospital as there is in a patient service job. So we didn't count when we're doing that calculation for private sector offices, we didn't count jobs in education, in health services, or in public administration. Okay, now
Okay, thank you, Tom. In the interest of time, I think you provided a lens that maybe many have not